All right. Well, so I want to respond to your questions about the difference between average rate of change and instantaneous rate of change. What I want to do is think about it through the lens of a little kid playing with Hot Wheels, because I imagine many of us were those little kids with those Hot Wheels, and we were asking the same types of questions in our head that we're going to start talking about as we build the bridge from pre-calculus to calculus. And one of those questions is like, how fast is that car going? And like if I pause that video at any moment, exactly how fast is that car traveling is the idea of instantaneous rate of change. The idea of average rate of change, well, let's go back a little bit, because I asked you about how you were feeling, and I asked you to give me a graph, and I picked out a couple that I thought were worth sharing. And the first one is that it was just very real. It was very true. These past few weeks have been really, really hard on me. I had crazy bad anxiety during scheduling, and it was the worst time around. A couple of days probably marked the worst in my life, but hey, I'm rebounding. So, and I picked that because it's sad, and I think it takes courage to express that. And also, it ends on a happy note with a little smiley face. So I appreciate that, and I hope that really is getting better, and that's not just some pressure to say it's getting better. But if you have nothing left to try, I would suggest try go and find some Hot Wheels and building some racetracks with them, because that'll brighten your face. That'll put a smile on your face. Every Saturday, I start something new, and my stress and energy level are much higher. That's interesting. This one, I got the flu last week. That's the main reason why my energy level dipped. You can tell by the slope of this graph that when it dipped fast. And when the flu was over, it rose fast. And then after it finished, the flu, it seems like the flu was over here, and then it started to get better. I don't know exactly why, but it got better at a constant rate. So I thought that was cool. More questions about the difference between average rate of change and instantaneous rate of change. Where did the formula delta y delta x come from? What is the idea of h as we find the limit as h approaches zero? These are good questions. This is, I think, better to think about Hot Wheels than what I had originally introduced to you. But you're going to see, you've seen delta x and delta y in past math classes. Delta y over delta x is slope. And it's like if I pick 2 points from here to here and I create a line between them, this is x1, this is x2, this is y1, this is y2. This right here is delta x. This right here is delta y. And the slope is the rise over run. Okay, so delta, this triangle delta is for the Greek letter D, and it refers to change in y over change in x. And when we go into calculus, we're going to start to see it as dy dx. Okay, those little d's stand for delta. And that's like the big thing. Well, there'll probably be other big things, but that's a very big thing in calculus. The other thing about this is, and this comes up in some of the further questions, is that we're not talking about a straight line. We're talking about a curve, or something that's nonlinear. And oftentimes what we're talking about is using a line to approximate an average rate of change. So if I look at the average rate of change of that line over that interval, I'm going to use a line to approximate it, although that thing is not linear. And so you might think of, like, what if I went and I drove to LA? And what if I know LA is 400 miles away? Let's say it took me, I don't know, 6 hours to get there. Could you calculate what my average speed was? And I think you could. You could say 400 miles divided by 6 is, well, it's more than 60 miles per hour, and it's less than 70 miles per hour. You could calculate exactly what my average rate of change was based on the two distances that I gave you. Does that mean that I was going 67 miles per hour for the entire trip? No. Does it mean that I was going 67 miles per hour for at least one point during the trip. I think it does mean that. But the average rate of change is kind of like based on that whole trip, how how fast did I average? The instantaneous rate of change is like, all right, when I was at some point, like what is there? There's a big pass down there. I forget the name of it, but like maybe when I was going by that Harris Ranch, what was my speed? It was probably faster because I wanted to get away from that stench that you smell going past that place. But the instantaneous rate of change is the idea of what does h as h goes to 0. So like you can think of this part right here as h, and as we get closer and closer to 0, actually I think I have a Desmos thing that'll show this a little bit better. So if this is an example of a graph, this is my average speed. We're thinking of what happens as h gets closer and closer to 0, because as it gets closer and closer to 0, we're moving from an average rate of change to an instantaneous rate of change. And so I set this up to show you that this is what we're trying to do. What we're trying to find is the tangent line. Okay, and so the tangent line is the line that goes through a curve at one particular point, and it has the same slope as that curve. Somebody asked this yesterday. I've heard of tangents and circles. What does it have to do with tangents and circles? Well, sometimes your teacher will be talking, and as we talk, we go round and round in circles. And then sometimes, like this used to be a game that kids would play when I was in high school, like you can ask a teacher a question and get them to go off on a tangent. Well, a tangent is, in math, sort of like that. It's just a line that hits a curve, and it hits a curve at exactly one point. And depending on where it hits that curve, it has the same slope as the curve at that point. So that's the idea. It's the same idea. It's just a pre-calculus or calculus version instead of a geometry version. And as h goes to 0, we get to that point where it is a tangent, and it's h never becomes 0. It's like a concept that you think about, like infinity. Like I have my other nephew likes to talk about infinity. What's the biggest number is infinity? What's one less than infinity? Well, I don't know. It seems like it's still infinity, but I could show you that I can get even smaller, and I can zoom in here, and I'm getting even smaller, and I could do this again, but h would never actually be 0. Calculus is the idea of like these concepts of infinite, but you often think of infinitely big and you forget to think about infinitely small. This idea of a limit is like on the infinitely small, and I'm sure, well, just to belabor the point, I will do this. I could make this even a whole nother degree smaller, and it becomes like fractals. It's not changing. It's scale independent. I could just keep doing this if I wanted to, but I have other things to do. Like answer the rest of these questions. So for the next ones I think were related. Why do the equations of AROC and IROC work like they do? What does IROC find that AROC doesn't? How does the limit statement affect IROC, and when should you use AROC versus IROC? How would you know when to use AROC or IROC? I think it's going to tell you, like I think in CPM, it'll usually say you find the AROC, but average stands for average rate of change. So if the question is asking you for some kind of average, then you're going to use AROC, and I stands for instantaneous rate of change. So if it's asking you what was the speed at an exact moment, then you're going to use IROC. And if it sometimes will contextualize, like you'll see that h is really small, and what they're doing is trying to introduce this concept of the limit as h goes to 0. What's that speed of that moment in time when I pause the video? How fast is that Hot Wheel traveling? What's the difference between calculating the average rate of change for a linear line and a nonlinear line? When you're calculating the average rate of change for something that's nonlinear, then we're going to use something that's linear to approximate it. That's the idea there. That's like if I went back and made h big here, it'd take a while. But then what I would see is that the only way to approximate this average rate of change is using a line. Why does IROC only touch at one point? I hope I already answered that. Can I buy an IROC? Are they cool and fast? There's some things that your math teacher isn't here to teach you. You can use Google to find that. How do we know when to use AROC and IROC? What's an example problem with AROC and IROC, and when and how to differentiate them? So when we choose the H, can we choose any points? For now, you're really not going to be choosing much. You're going to be asked to apply things, but it's the concept, like understanding this concept is going to determine whether you feel empowered in calculus or whether you feel like completely over your head and drowning, in my opinion. So you should keep thinking about it, and you should keep finding ways to ask about it. How do we know when to use AROC and IROC? You're going to be told what's an example problem with AROC and IROC and when and how to differentiate them. That's a good problem to be thinking about, and it's a good problem to be answering as you do the homework type things. I really do think this thing that we're doing right now is kind of rare. I've been teaching the subject for several years now, and I know that it's very difficult to ask about conceptual material in a classroom setting. Even in a situation like you guys are in, where you have a ton of resources and there's very few things that are preventing you from asking these questions. Like, it's still hard. It's just hard to ask a question about math a lot of times, but it looks like it's easier to do it in Desmo. So I'm excited, and I think we could be onto something new. So I encourage you all to act like we're onto something new here and continue to engage in ways that maybe you haven't been able to in the past. And that might mean telling me that you think I'm stupid, if you think I'm stupid, or find better words than that. But find ways to challenge me and criticize me if you think that's what I need. All right. Thank you.